Returning to us now and to continue our conversation is Ron Hosko, the Executive Director of the Law Enforcement Defense Fund, also a former Assistant Director at the FBI. Ron, you wrote a scathing letter to President Obama less than 2 weeks ago detailing the damage done to the relationship between the DOJ and law enforcement over the past 6 years. Tell us why you felt compelled to write that letter.
We have these events that occur from time to time, and repeatedly now, it does feel as though the president and the attorney general, by their acts, by their deeds, by their omissions, are unappreciative of the hard work and the sacrifice of law enforcement. We saw it happen in Harvard with his comments about the police acting stupidly after their engagement with a Harvard professor.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier today with John Gizzi, our chief White House correspondent. You know, again, the president saying yesterday very specifically that he doesn't want to get involved in commenting on an ongoing investigation, but we've seen him do that before. Do you think this is the president being disingenuous or somebody who may have learned from prior mistakes?
I had hoped that he would remain mute on the Ferguson situation until the facts were known. And early on, we heard comments and we heard reference to race and young black men, people of color being stopped inordinately, and making the connection between those instances and what happened in Ferguson. And here we have an officer who took a life that's the last thing a police officer wants to do in his job. And we have what felt like the president putting his thumb on the scale. We had DOJ weighing in with a patterns and practices investigation in the immediate wake of. That could have been held off. Ideally, it would have happened before to correct actions in Ferguson if they needed to, rather than within a few days of the investigation.
Yeah, and Ron, you remember too, and so do a lot of folks at home, where this story went right after it broke. Of course, there was the immediate tragedy involved here in the loss of life, and there was a lot of finger pointing as well. But then the story kind of took on a life of its own, and we started to talk a lot about the militarization of local police departments here. Nobody's really talking about that anymore, especially after what we've seen the last 2 nights.
One of my biggest concerns coming out of Ferguson and in this discussion that our country has to have is personal responsibility. What brought Darren Wilson and Michael Brown together? A crime, a violent crime committed by Michael Brown. And that occurs across this country. That's why police are getting into these interactions with the citizens, because they're responding frequently to tragedies, to shootings, to armed robberies all around our country. And it does bring the police into these contacts. That's just what happened in Ferguson. And for the media or others to suggest over-militarized police, the media is to blame, the National Guard failed to appear. What about personal responsibility of the criminals who are engaged in these violent events that bring them into violent contact with the police? We saw it this morning with 2 FBI agents shot in St. Louis. That's
right. We have reported on that, those 2 FBI agents. And it gives you a good idea of how dangerous the job is for law enforcement at all levels, whether it be the FBI or a local police department. And oftentimes, as was the case in St. Louis, the two are working together. It's still very dangerous here. Now, we have this administration, we have the DOJ, we know Eric Holder's going away, but still, over the course of the next 2 years, while we still have this administration in power, do you see any change in the trend line in terms of the relationship between communities like Ferguson and their police departments?
I don't see it today. I see protest, I see anger, and I see folks on the other side of the discussion saying, why did Michael Brown attack this police officer? Why in our country, the FBI just reported on this a week or so ago for 2013, I believe, almost 50,000 reported assaults on the police during the course of a year. That's just what's reported. So the actual number would be far higher. Here's another example of that, where there was a violent assault on the police. We need a national conversation, not in the wake of a tragedy, not in the wake of another shooting, but the bigger conversation with the right leadership.
You're absolutely right, Ron, too. And I'm thinking about this, too, and I'm not trying to make a comparison between Michael Brown and Eric Frein, but we also had the case, too, of those police officers being ambushed in Pennsylvania. Another example of how dangerous the job can be, even when they're not responding to a call. Ron Hosko, thanks so much for being with us, sir.
I'm happy to do it. Thanks, John.
All right, we're back with more here in America's Forum right after this.